Hi, everyone, welcome to week 7. This week we're looking at the nervous system and kind of how everything functions and works with that. We're about halfway through the semester, so good job so far on what you've been doing. Next week is midterms, so make sure that you're taking care of yourself so you can be ready for that. Announcements for this week. So we just have the extra credit. That's due the week of midterms. That's just looking at cardiology, and especially looking at just how things work with heart attacks in male versus female populations. It's actually really interesting. You'll see some differences there in how the symptoms present in the two groups. And then also, I believe, I'm not sure if this is part of the assignment, but you can also do some stuff looking at how they treat it because they actually use different medications based on whether it's a male or female patient, just because for some reason, some medications work better on female populations compared to male populations and vice versa. So super interesting stuff. A lot of cool research out there in medicine on that cardiology stuff and that cardiac research. As well, we have a quiz this week, and that's just going over musculoskeletal system. So that's just a review from last week. We also have our discussion board. So you're just creating an infographic, basically. You don't have to make it as like a poster infographic, but make sure that you're including your medical terms, that you're following the instructions, that you have hit all the criteria so you can hit full, so you can get all the points for the assignment. Okay, so looking at the nervous system. So the nervous system is kind of the control center. Everything happens from this system. So it's pretty important. The central nervous system is it's kind of the control center, while the peripheral nervous system is our messenger system. So everything kind of relates back to the nervous system, just because, especially the central nervous system, because everything radiates out from there. So when we look at our central nervous system, or the CNS, you have the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. This is the control center. So, like I was saying, everything happens at the brain and it spreads out from hormone function to conscious activity, involuntary action. All that happens in the brain, or it starts there. It starts as an electrical signal, and then it gets sent out through the neurons to the surrounding areas. So if you wanted to move your hand, your brain would say, hey, I want to move the hand. A signal will get sent, and all of a sudden your hand is moving. So it moves pretty fast. It's pretty cool. A lot of the motor stuff happens, like muscle movement happens with electricity. There is some chemical stuff that happens with hormones and what's called the endocrine system. You'll learn more about that if you take neuroscience. Um, those of you that are pre-med or pre-PA will probably end up in that neuroscience class. So super interesting. You'll get to learn a lot more about the brain and its different divisions and kind of everything that happens up there. So pretty cool stuff. The next one is your peripheral nervous system. So that's just all your other nerves and uh, fiber tracts, basically. So spinal cord in your brain is the central nervous system. And then what happens is the peripheral nervous system connects into the spinal cord, and it has two kind of main divisions. So you have sensory neurons, which take, they have receptors either in your hand or your skin or whatever, and it sends it back to the spinal cord, which goes back to the brain. And you have the motor neurons, which start at the spinal cord and go to the muscle. It connects right into the muscle and tells it what to do. So this is kind of your messenger system. It's what allows the brain and the spinal cord to know what's going on outside. Kind of takes, it's your information receiving place. So super cool. Biggest thing with the peripheral nervous system is that it goes to a lot of different places. And then also you have a bunch of different type of receptors, which we talked about earlier in the semester. So if you end up in anatomy class or neuroscience, you're going to learn about all those different receptor types. I'll go more in depth into that. So your nervous system can also be divided into 3 different systems as well. So we talked about, you had your central nervous system, your peripheral nervous system, but it can also be divided into your autonomic nervous system and your somatic nervous system and your enteric. So autonomic means involuntary. So your brain just kind of is running it in the background. Think of it like a computer where you have processes working in the background. Then your somatic is your conscious stuff. So that's motor function, that's all that other stuff. So, somatic you can control, autonomic you can't. So that's, your autonomic can include breathing, heart rate stuff, a lot of your digestive, actually, no, sorry, not your digestive system, and that's enteric. But just kind of all that involuntary stuff that you don't really have a ton of control over. Um, and so with breathing, you can make it conscious, but for the most part, it is autonomic. Um, then you have your enteric. So that's the digestive system. So the interesting thing about the enteric, it used to be that it just was autonomic and somatic, but then they discovered that the enteric system could kind of just function on its own. So it doesn't even need input from the CNS or PNS. It just kind of functions on its own. So super cool stuff. So functionality. So you have a bunch of different things going on with the nervous system. So, you have your neurons, which are the cells. If you look at that picture, you have the body of the cell, which is where the impulse starts, and then um, you have your axon, you have your dendrites. So the axon is what carries the signal away. The dendrite is what receives it. So you can kind of see that in the image on the right. But then you have all these different support cells as well, and the kind of their function. So in the central nervous system, you have what's called the astrocyte, and that's kind of a support. So what it does is it actually, the neuron can't really take care of itself, and so the astrocyte is kind of like its caretaker. Then you have your oligodendrocytes, and what those do is those actually take fats or lipids, and it'll wrap the axon in what's called myelin. So this myelination will actually increase in the efficiency of the cell. So if you're an athlete at all, you will find that athletes like sprinters or power athletes, those that move really fast, that they have increased myelination of their axons. And what that does is it makes it so that the signal travels a lot faster, so you can get more uh, motor unit recruitment, but also you can send more signals. So if you're a sprinter, that means higher turnover, run faster, all the good stuff. Then you have your microglia. So that's kind of the immune system for the CNS. It kind of protects you from foreign pathogens. You have what's called the blood-brain barrier, which it's a barrier that actually filters everything between your spinal cord, like basically the space where your brain and spinal cord exist is in isolation from the rest of the body to prevent bacteria and viruses from getting in there. And so there's that defense system. The microglia are there in case something does get through and kind of to keep you healthy and safe. The last one is the ependymal cells. And so what those do, excuse me, is those actually create your cerebral spinal fluid. So what that is that's that fluid that your brain kind of floats around in, as well as what your spinal cord's in. And so those cells will actually filter out fluid from the blood to create that CSF fluid. And then in your peripheral nervous system, you have your Schwann cells and your satellite cells. So your satellite cells they're like your astrocytes. They're your support cells. They kind of keep everything alive, healthy. They kind of do a lot of that cell function for the neurons to keep them going. Then your Schwann cells are like your oligodendrocytes. Their job is to myelinate everything. So, like I said, myelination is super important for motor and muscle develop or motor function because it just allows it's like insulation for wiring. It just allows more efficient signal to travel, allows it to travel faster. So definitely stuff you want. With the nervous system, you'll have some conditions that you'll see. So a lot of those conditions are kind of related somehow to these three things. So electrical activity, loss of blood flow, and then degeneration of cell types. So your electric activity, think like epilepsy or seizures. You have things that are just kind of firing at random. And so that's a lot of your nervous system conditions right there. Um, and so usually that happens because something's not regulating right in the brain or um, in the spinal cord. And so, yeah. The next one is loss of blood flow. That's like your strokes. And so you have a lot of blood flow and a lot of blood vessels in the brain. And so, um, if something happens and you get a blockage, you get very quickly, you can get impaired function of the brain, and it can cause permanent damage pretty quick if you don't treat it. The reason why is because the brain doesn't really store carbohydrates. Your muscles, interesting enough, they actually will store what's called glycogen, which is a type of carb. It's a form of carbohydrate, and so if it loses blood flow, it can survive for a little bit, but the brain does not store any fuel source nearby, and so it needs that constant fuel from oxygen and carbohydrates to be able to function. Carbohydrates are actually the main source of fuel for the brain, and so if you're on a low carb diet, you might find that school mental activity is kind of rough. So keep that in mind with your nutrition. And the last part is just degeneration of cell types. So sometimes you'll see what's called demyelinization. So that's just where the neurons on the myelin sheath kind of starts deteriorating, falling apart. It's not really being kept up. You'll see separation of cells from the neurons actually separating from each other so they can't pass signals. And so a lot of those things like Parkinson's or dementia, a lot of those have to do with, something's happening with the cells. They're not healthy and they're struggling. So, yeah, so that's kind of the lecture for this week. Make sure you get those assignments done. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I will see you guys next week.